Hello, and welcome back to the Dual Use Tech Summit. I'm Laura Winter. I am the editor and host of the DownLink podcast, which, for those of you who are interested in the intersection of space, the space business, and defense, you can get it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, this segment is going to be really good fun, but also serious. I'm going to ask you in our audience to at once use your imagination and think strategically about the long-term goals you want to achieve for our nation's economy and security in space, because it's already intertwined and dependent on space systems, right? What's the off-world destination technologically or economically after 2030? Or how about after 20 or 30 years? How are we or how should we leverage what are now just nascent technologies to set up future generations of Americans for success in space, for the fifth industrial revolution? And how do we secure it? So I'm really excited for this discussion. So I'm honored to have with us here today two gentlemen who spend a great deal of time thinking about the future in space beyond 2030. We have United States Space Force Colonel Wallace Rhet Turnbull, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Space Systems Integration Office at Space Systems Command, and Zach Brown, who is the Senior Project Leader for Strategic Foresight at the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the Dual Use Tech Summit.
Hi, Laura. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, same. Sounds like this is going to be a fun conversation.
Now, I think just to start us off, we need to answer why, as in, why is it important to not just think, but actually plan and make strategic investments in space technology development today, as in this year, in 2024? For a future that is 20 or 30 years out? And I'm pointedly starting with this question because the pushback is going to be, well, hey, we already have a ton of strategically critical issues that we've got to tackle right here on Earth with space systems. And we need to do it like now, right? Like securing satellite communications for operations that counter Houthi attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea region, for Operation Prosperity Guardian. So, there are thousands of terminals and satellite signals being jammed and degraded, which is a technical challenge directly related to space, the economy, and national interests. So, guys, right? Like, why spend time, money, and effort thinking beyond 2030? And Zach, why don't you start us off?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for that very simple question to answer.
My pleasure.
Obviously, I love talking about this kind of topic, working on the strategy and foresight team at Aerospace. This is kind of our bread and butter. And even before I joined Aerospace, I've been thinking about this a lot because, as I've told you before, like I come to this from an intelligence background. I've been an analyst for a long time. And I like to think about how systems work together to create what we think of as the future. I would say that, everyone agrees, I think, that we're in a crucial period of change in the global environment. We're in what, a lot of folks call a VUCA environment. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. The pace of change itself seems to be accelerating. So I fully understand that leaders, particularly in the Defense Department and the intelligence community, and also in the private sector, are swamped by day-to-day crises that emerge, and we're responding to all these different activities. But I would say it's important for us to step back and think about how the actions that we're taking now, or the actions that we're not taking, will carry forth into this future. Because I like to tell people, I think of the future as what results from the interaction of lots of different systems all around the world, things that you and I are doing every day, things that we're not doing, the decisions we make, the decisions we don't make, things we say, the things we don't say, the things we do, the things we don't do. And if we think more proactively about what kind of future we want to have, we can make those small investments and small changes now in the present and make those futures that we want to happen a little bit more likely to come. We can't predict what's going to happen, but we can do the things we can do now to ensure that the future we get is the one that is more preferable for us and for the nation and the world, I think.
And Rhet, want to take a swing at it?
Sure. Yeah. A couple different thoughts. So obviously we have a lot of work to do right now. And so we definitely need to focus on some of those near-term challenges that you talked about in your introduction for sure. But we also, as Zach said, like the rate of change is happening so fast that if we wait to see where things go and try to catch up, we'll never get there. And it's a lot easier to lead the change than it is to catch up on the change. And if we, as a spacefaring nation, where space is a vital part of our economy, don't take a leadership role on trying to understand where things are headed and prepare now for that potential future, then somebody else is going to do it for us. And we're going to be in that, we're going to be playing catch up. And I would rather be leading the pack than trying to play catch up. And so I think it's important to balance the focus on the near term priorities and then think about where do we really want to go. And then the other thing I'll add, just from I'm a technologist at heart, an engineer, is from a technology perspective, right? Some of this stuff takes a really long time to develop. And if you don't start now, then you'll never get there, right? Because the technology, there's a lot of learning that has to go on. There's a lot of experimentation that we have to do to really understand. If we envision the future that we want, just one example, there's a lot of interest in the moon now and what's happening in cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. A lot of technology is going into making that a reality, but it takes incremental steps and learning. Just last week, we saw an American spacecraft land on the moon for the first time since 1972. We have to do that development and that learning and that trial and that experimentation now to really understand where we want to go. And if we really want to be a spacefaring nation where we're going back and forth between the Earth and the moon, for example, you're going to have communications and logistics and refueling and all of those things. And that takes time to build out. And we've got to start that now.
Now, you're both from defense-minded organizations, right? One that's a branch of the military that organizes, trains, and equips space forces, and one that is a federally funded research and development center. So, Rhet, how does Space Systems Command approach this long-term strategic thinking about the future? Beyond 2030, what say are your top 2 priorities? You could possibly even go to 3. And I'd like to even just backtrack onto something that you said, the Intuitive Machines IM-1 mission being the first U.S. mission to the moon since 1972, which is amazing. But also what's really amazing is that it was a commercial mission, right? And that there should be at least one more commercial mission from the United States this year. So things are certainly changing on the moon, right? So how do we protect that? How do we protect, U.S. intellectual property that's going to the moon, so on and so on? So yeah, I'm really interested to hear what your, priorities are for, planning for this future.
Yeah. So, obviously a lot of different priorities that we have because we have a big mission set, a lot of different things we're working on. But relative to the point that you made about this was a commercial company that landed a spacecraft on the moon. I think that how do we work with the commercial sector is definitely one of our priorities and one where we're putting a lot of effort in. In fact, just this last year, we stood up a commercial space office whose only job is to focus on what is the commercial sector doing and how can we apply that to solve our problems today and in the future. In the past, space was a very expensive thing. It still is, but it's getting cheaper, right? And it at one time, it was something only nation states could do. And you needed the resources of a nation state to operate, to get to space and to operate in space. That's not true today. Today, the largest operator of space vehicles in the world is a private company, SpaceX. They're headquartered down the road from where we're sitting here at Space Systems Command. That's a very different world from the one 20, 30 years ago. I joined the military 29 years ago flying satellites for the U.S. Air Force, where we had a couple of dozen spacecraft total, right? And today SpaceX operates over 4,000. Very, very different world. We want to be part of that world, and we want to leverage those capabilities to help do our job, right? It's frankly, it's a lot cheaper for us to let some of those other companies do the research and development and do the fielding and just be a customer of some of those things. And so the priority for me in terms of this question is thinking through that of what are the things that we as a service, as a military service, really need to organically do and invest in, because those are uniquely military things. And then what are the things that we really could use commercial capabilities for? And then how do we structure our planning, our architectures, our investments, so that we can take advantage of those strategic and commercial capabilities?
But that's a lot of what to do with like what's happening now, right? Because with the Commercial Space Office, I know Colonel Knisely and his group. I mean, they are definitely, getting requirements from, basically from the one combat command, right? Space Command, but also from others, and trying to get things from the commercial industry, out there as soon as possible. But what about beyond 2030?
Yeah, so
Because that's hard,
it is
right?
hard.
I
It is
mean,
hard.
you only have so many dollars. That's
Yeah,
why I'm
absolutely. You
wondering,
only have
like,
so many dollars.
what your priorities would, what you think they should be, 20 years from now. Like, what do you want to do now that will set up the Space Force like in 20 years?
Yeah. So I don't know what technology is going to look like in 20 years or 30 years, right? It certainly couldn't have predicted it when I started 29 years ago.
True.
But we can have an idea, right? And we can help shape it we can shape it through the investments that we make and the partnerships that we build. So I think we can help guide that future. But when I think about what does that future look like, for me, one of the key things that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is what would it mean if we didn't have to think about maneuvering and where we go. Lieutenant General John Shaw, who recently retired as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command, coined the term maneuver without regret. Today, every single spacecraft we launch has a limited life in it, right? It's got a certain amount of fuel, and when that's used up, it's gone, and you can't move, which really limits your ability to use those spacecraft in novel ways to, be able to respond to new missions, to new threats, and those kinds of things, right? So to me, that future is, hey, I'm a big sci-fi nut. I read a lot of science fiction, and you never think, nobody ever talks about fuel and Delta V in those science fiction stories, right? They just go where they need to go. What would that kind of future look like, and what do we need to get there, right? And so, from a very practical perspective, if that's sort of the future we envision, you got to back that up and say, okay, what do you need today to make that possible, right? So someday, what would that mean? That would mean maybe new types of propulsion, and our labs are certainly investing in that, and I know the commercial sector is as well, and we're very interested in some of those things. It might mean new types of electrical systems, like nuclear technology and spacecraft is something that there's a lot of interest in now. Not necessarily from Space Force, but just in general, that's where the technology is going now, that it's safe enough and small enough and to do that kind of thing. It also might mean, hey, how do we refuel? Are there gas stations in space, right? And if you think about the very practical thing of, hey, I need to either pull up to the gas station and put fuel into my car, or I need to pull my electric vehicle up and plug it in to charge. All of that infrastructure works today because we built out an infrastructure that's based on that has a logistics tail to be able to supply all of those things. It has standards and interfaces. The nozzle fits into the gas tank. The charger plugs into your charging port. And all of that had to be built out. We need to think about, what does that look like for space, right? And what are the standards that we're going to use? It doesn't make sense, in my opinion, to have a different standard for the military than it does for commercial, right? Because commercial capabilities are going to need the same kind of things. So can we partner with the commercial companies who are building that infrastructure out now? Here's the interface that we're going to use. Here's what the nozzle looks like. Here's what the port looks like. Here's the protocol we use for actually getting the spacecraft to autonomously connect and transfer fuel or energy or whatever it is, right? How are we going to stage that? How are we going to replenish it? We need to think about those things today if we're going to have those in 20 years.
And Zach, what about the Aerospace Corporation's approach and priorities? I mean, you think about this a lot.
Yeah, well, I think everything that Rhet was saying is spot on, and I happen to agree as a sci-fi nerd and as a space aficionado. I think a lot of the stuff that we don't talk about enough is what I'll just refer to as orbital or cislunar infrastructure, like the kind of infrastructure that expands all the way out from space, all the way down to the ground and into society. And these are the things that we don't spend enough time thinking about the people, the systems, the standards that will underlie and underwrite any expansion cislunar that we want to do in the next 20, 30, 50 years. And it's very cool that we're developing new propulsion systems. It's very cool that we're sending more launches into orbit. But there's a lot of other work that has to go on top of that for the type of future we want in space. And that raises the question of, what is the future we want? We can talk all day about, is it lunar habitation? Is it going to Mars? Is it, expanding into the asteroid belt? All these different things that people talk about a lot. That requires infrastructure, standards, and more. I don't want to say boring because it's not boring. A lot of people are fascinated by it, but it's hard work that has to be done.
Yeah.
There's also the other aspects of, radiation problems and, biological, how do we do, are we able to carry offspring to term in space if we want to inhabit other worlds in full time with settlements? Those are questions that need to be answered. And it's great that everyone is excited about the future of space right now. It's an exciting time to be part of the space community for sure. But we have a lot of work to do on figuring out some of these hard problems. And I think you raise a great point about infrastructure, but I want to foot stomp.
All right. Well, just going on from that, and Zach, this kind of came from one of the articles that I read that you authored. And, what are some of the key drivers, or should I say forces, shaping the future of dual-use space technologies beyond the next 5 years? Or up to 20, 30 years. What are those forces? And I'm using that word really pointedly because it's something that you used in your article to explain how we shape our future.
Yeah. So just to cue in the rest of the audience that's listening. So briefly, I think of the future in terms of forces of continuity and forces of change, and they kind of butt up against each other. And whatever wins out, that's kind of the future that we get. Forces of continuity can be anything from, we all do things every day. It's like our patterns that we act out. We go get our coffee at the same place. We do. Those are forces of continuity. And then a force of change might be something disruptive that happens, like that coffee shop we go to closes down and a new one pops up. And which one do we start going to? So over time, these patterns that we all sort of go through as a civilization and as a people and as organizations, as enterprises, those sort of write and code out the future that we're going to get because we're on these tracks, and there's disruptions from time to time that happen. So that's kind of my thinking about the future in a nutshell. I think the biggest forces of change that are happening right now, I mean, we talked about the VUCA environment we live in, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen. Of course, the world's a complex system. Emergence is a property, and there's going to be things that we cannot predict no matter how much data we collect. But I think it's very safe to say digitization is going to be a force that continues over the next 20, 30 years. Everything will be codified, quantified. The expansion of sensors, not only in orbit, but also in the atmosphere, all the way down to the ground, in our phones, in our street lamps, in our appliances, subsurface, underwater sensors, all kinds of sensors everywhere. So there's quantification of data from ubiquitous sensors and imaging. I mean, I think that's a driving force that is going to continue for the next 20, 30 years. AI is going to continue, whether or not there's ups and downs. I mean, we know from the history of artificial intelligence that people may be familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. AI tends to go more like in a sine wave, like it goes up and down over, the last AI summer and winter. We're in an AI summer or spring right now, and there's some signs that might be slowing down soon. But I'm sure that's a trend that will continue to go on for 20, 30 years. AI is going to get better. This is OpenAI just released their new video producing AI application. I forget what it's called, but it can produce, basically live action content on demand. And that's the worst it's ever going to be. It's only going to get better from that. So we're in a brave world of content creation and our generative AI for sure. So it's digitization, it's artificial intelligence, robotics are obviously going to be a driving force in the future. And then sadly, on the other side, I think the social and political forces, lack of trust in institutions. It's an increasingly transparent world we live in. There's various sources of conflicting sources of authority and information people can go to. Those are problems that we have to deal with as a society and as a country. So that's another driving force. And then the last one I would say is increasingly people, living online lives like in the internet. Everything there's a great phrase that I've seen, and I know I'm driving on, so I'll try to wrap it up here.
I just want you to get back to space a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little.
I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
So and then commercialization, bringing it back to space. I think
there you go.
That the expansion of commercial space enterprise is a thing that's going to continue as launch prices continue to go down and as we continue to put more things into orbit. That's certainly another trend.
What do you think, Rhet? What are some of the key drivers from the perch that you said, that for space and for the next, let's say, 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, my perspective is colored through a sort of a defense lens, right? And so I think in terms of geopolitics, great power competition, it's not going away. It's here. It's very real. That drives competition amongst nations here on Earth, and it drives competition amongst nations in space. And so, from my perspective, I think that's one thing that we really need to be cognizant of and follow very closely, and that really should inform the choices that we make. As an example, China is making huge strides in space in their space program, both from their civil and commercial side, but also the military side. And nearly everything they do is dual use. It's both maybe have a commercial or civil use, but also a military use. We've seen China actually field and test anti-satellite weapons that are designed to effectively attack United States space capabilities, both commercial and military. So that's the world we live in today. I don't think that competition is going to go away. I think it will become more intense as we move out beyond Earth orbit into cislunar space. Those same interests, economic interests, geopolitical interests, are still going to be there, and we have to be very cognizant of that. And I think that really needs to inform where we go from an overall strategy and what kind of architecture we want to build out.
Yeah, can I add on to that?
Of course you can.
Well, just to dovetail with the point about China, I mean, I think, even if, China's not going to go away. China is a civilizational state that's been around for thousands of years, and they have a continental sized nation state, and they have the money to invest in space capabilities on par with the United States.
Well, they have a command economy as well. So that makes it easier. And the other thing that they also have, I'm sorry to butt in, but I do want to underscore what Rhet had just said, but they have a policy of civil military fusion, right? So you can't actually get a license to be a private launch company without actually signing for the license that states that if the state needs it for whatever reason, they can basically come and have it. So it's a very different scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have a vision for the long-term expansion into the solar system. And, do we have a matching vision? If we do, I haven't seen it, because I think that we tend to, in this country and in our system, we tend to focus on the near-term challenge. And particularly in the defense and the national security space, we're focused on the peer rival, the near peer rival, the challenge of a near-term threat of a war with China or Russia or another great adversary, even a lesser adversary like Iran or North Korea. And those are very important things that we have to do and what the national security enterprise exists to undertake. But the question is, where does our national narrative and grand strategy on where we want to go and what is the future of space we want as a nation and as a free democratic people? I think that is a compelling question to start thinking about.
Which is exactly the question I was going to ask, actually. You're killing me, Zach. My gosh, I spent all this time preparing to interview you. So
cut that out. You can just ask.
Well, we're going to get on it. But I was going to say, right, you are aware that China recently revealed a 4-stage roadmap, right? I mean, this isn't some cute wee little thing. This is huge, for space resources utilization, and it will reportedly, eventually span the entire solar system by 2100. I mean, that's a vision, right?
Yeah,
That's a
long.
real North Star kind of thing. And it starts at the moon, right? Goes to the near Earth asteroids and onto Mars. And yeah, I mean, the question has to be asked, and I do think we need to bat it around even a little bit more. We're not going to kill the horse or a dead horse, but we do need to, keep kicking at it a bit, because the United States does not yet have a comparable plan. And it's like a lack of a vision or of a plan, but it brings uncertainty, right? About where we as a nation, as the leader of the Artemis Accords, want to do. So how does that affect our planning, right? How do you guys navigate through that, right? And Rhet, I'm going to hit you up first.
Sure. And I'll be caveat right up front, right? That from my perspective as a uniformed military officer, that sort of overarching strategy, I think, is important. But it is up to the civilian leadership of this country to figure out what that strategy is, right?
Right.
But my job as a member of the Space Force, our mission in the Space Force is to secure our nation's interest in, from, and to space. That means whatever that strategy is, we have to be prepared to secure our interests there. And so that's where Space Force, I think, is focused, right? Certainly on the so when you look at what we're doing near, mid, and far term, certainly in the near term, we're focused on right now. What do we do to secure our nation's interests around the world? And we're busy every single day doing that, right? And the midterm and far term, we're planning for what we think is that potential future, where, as I said, there's going to continue to be great power competition. Our interests are going to expand beyond sort of geosynchronous Earth orbit, where they are today, out into cislunar space and the rest of the solar system. And so we've got to think now about, if we have to secure our nation's interest on Mars, what does that mean, right? If we have to do that on the moon, what does that mean? Back to some of the points Zach was making earlier about infrastructure. It's not sexy. It is kind of boring to a lot of people, but it's really important. You can't do that job.
It's fun and nerdy.
You can't do that job
it's
without
cool.
infrastructure, right? And you need that. And so we've got to think through, what is that infrastructure look like? How much of that is civil? How much of that is military? How much of that is commercial? What is our job vis-a-vis some of the commercial capabilities? If China attacks a commercial operator, what is Space Force's role? We still have to work through with our civilian leadership on what does that mean, but we can't sit still. So we've got to invest today to be ready to do that.
I've got a follow on just with what you just said about, whether or not a commercial actor, came under attack. But what about a commercial actor that just is in distress, right? What if it's not even one of our commercial actors, but because of the Outer Space Treaty, we have obligations, right? Just like we do, in the high seas, right? If somebody is in distress, we go. How does that work?
Yeah, so today I don't know. I mean, there is an obligation under the Outer Space Treaty to provide aid to human space flight in distress, and we would have to work through with NASA and the national leadership on what does that mean? What can we do? We don't have search and rescue for space today, right? Like the Air Force and the Navy have search and rescue capabilities for downed aircraft and that kind of thing. We don't have that for space. Is that in our plan? Not today. Is that something that we could do in the future? Maybe. Is that something that a commercial operator could do in the future? Maybe. I think we have to think through that, and what's the right answer for the nation to do that. And that question will become more important as we start to send more and more humans into space.
Oh, we've got a few commercial space stations allegedly coming online, at least, 3 before the end of this decade. At least that's the plan. But Zach, what about you? I mean, we talk about, the vision or not having a similar vision. Maybe we don't need a similar vision to the Chinese, but they at least have one, right? And they're planning to it. and they're making investments to it. And they're even making investments to, well, I hate to say, but search and rescue. I mean, they did have a conference, I think about a year and a half ago or something like that, just specifically on, search and rescue in space and on the moon and stuff. So Zach, how do we plan despite not having that North Star?
Yeah. Well, I at first I would say, like, I empathize with Colonel Turnbull's issue.
I do too.
Yeah.
The military departments and the services within those departments, like the Space Force, are, they're charged with defending our interests in the domains that they are largely responsible for. And they always have to envision, what capabilities will they need in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years to meet the threats and have to maintain advantage or dominance over whatever those threats might be. Now, obviously, that's a difficult question. That's largely technology focused. Whatever the policy of the United States is in 20XX, the Space Force and the Air Force and the Army will execute and defend those policies. From a national level, from national command, we talk about national command authorities in the military sphere, but we're really talking about, I think, is what is our national conversation as a people in general, and through the democratic process, what do we want as a people for space and from space? And Americans, I think too few Americans understand how reliant their lives are upon space and the interactions they have every day with the space infrastructure that's in orbit today, because we've grown up with it. We've lived with it for now 50, 60, 75 years. And the things that we do every day we take for granted, and it's not until they come under threat that we will realize, unfortunately. Now, to answer your question, do we need a vision? I think we do. That's, my opinion is that we do. I think my team, if they were here, we have a report called Project North Star, which is about, what is America's guiding North Star vision for the long-term future. And the result of that was we really don't have one. We probably should think about having one, but the way that we do strategy in this country traditionally has been largely reactive. I don't think anyone would disagree that we focus on, the FIDEP, these 5-year cycles in the Defense Department. We focus on 4-year political process and 2 years for seats in Congress. And that's really as long-term as we go for strategy in this country. The president sets national security strategy every 4-ish years or so. But there's, that is the beauty of our system, in that it's kind of a bubbling up of all these different ideas, and we kind of figure a way out as we go forward. And that's markedly different from the way the Chinese Communist Party does things. They have a centralized direction and vision. Do we need a centralized direction? I don't think so. I think it's the beauty of our open system that we don't have that. But we should probably agree on what are some general things we want to achieve in the long term. Do we want to safeguard liberty and democracy for all people on Earth? Do we want to ensure Americans are prosperous and we have a place in the world and we're free from foreign coercion and intervention? All those things that everybody, I think, would agree upon as a nation. And what place of leadership or not do we want to have in the world? I mean, we have a place of leadership now. Do we want to retain that, or there's some who would say we should give it up? And it's not my job to say if they're right or wrong, but we need to have that conversation and decide what our vision is, because space plays such a central role in that, and will play an even larger role in that, certainly for the rest of the century and into our future.
So as we're going towards the future, right? And as you said, it was, it's very much based on technological developments, discoveries, how the commercial industry is pushing forward. Are they receiving the right signals to develop the technologies? But there's also this balance, right? There's this, trade-off between, risk and innovation when investing in space technology, which is usually inherently dual use, right? But you can't really push the limits of technology without rolling the dice, without taking risk, right? So like SpaceX does this, has already done this many times while testing out various prototypes for Starship. But we've seen 2 really big, risk-taking events, right, for the test launches. So how can we maybe make risk and risk-taking more palatable? How can we do that? Go for it, Zach.
Well,
Rhet's already like wiping his brow. Whew, I got time to think about this.
Look, I think it's a leadership thing. It's a leadership thing, and it's a cultural thing. Look, if you talk about risk taking, you don't get riskier than the guys in the 50s with the right stuff, the Buzz Aldrins. Like, we were a very risk, I don't know what's the opposite of averse, a risk embracing nation during the early Cold War when we had to get ahead of those pesky Soviets, and that was a motivating force.
But wasn't that interesting as well that at that time, when we really kicked off the space program, that we really did actually have a really long-term plan? I mean, we didn't just sort of like get on the moon in 4 years. You know what I mean? It did actually. It was that was a long-term vision, really.
It was a long-term vision
and a lot of risk. A lot of
left and right turns. There was a lot of risky exercises and test demonstrations, and people
and lives lost.
That's right. Should we try to regain some of that as a country? I think we probably should. I think because as things like same thing with artificial intelligence, and bear with me, as space becomes more routine over the last 50 years or so, it's also become more bureaucratized, and we need that for safety reasons, and we prioritize the safety of our astronauts and our systems. That's very important stuff. But we lose some of the innovativeness and the risk taking and the drive, I think, from the early days. And some would argue we're in a new period now. We may need to get back some of that culture. I tend to agree with that personally, but we still have to maintain the balance between. There's also the question of taxpayer money. Are we investing taxpayer money wisely? Of course, we want to be stewards of that in the government. Private sector has a little less of that, but they still have fiduciary responsibilities to their stakeholders and to their investors. So it's got to be a combination, and I'll come back to that continuity and change, forces that are kind of competing. You've got the risk averse and the risk taking, and they've got to have a conversation, and where that washes out, that's how we get ahead.
For you, Rhet, I do have to say that Space Force is in a wonderful but yet painful position, right? Because in the military, you don't join the military to be risk-free, right? I mean, let's be honest. We both deployed to Afghanistan. That certainly was not risk-free. That was just here on Earth, right? Space Force. It's inherently risky. And even more so when you think about the technologies that are necessary to keep our satellites, let alone, manned missions up there. So how are you guys able to go about making risk more palatable? And I would say that would be kind of a priority and yet a very tough thing to do, because if you can get the higher ups to accept more risk, you could actually test out more stuff.
Yeah, I think so. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an engineer at heart. It's been a long time since I had to whip out my HP 48 and crunch some numbers, but I am an engineer at heart. And so when I think about risk, I think of it from an engineering perspective, right? And from an engineering perspective, there's a handful of different ways that you can deal with risk. You can assume the risk, meaning that, hey, if the bad thing happens, that's okay. I can absorb that, right? You can mitigate it by let's understand what could cause the risk to occur, and then take some steps to prevent that. And then my favorite is you could shift it. You could make it somebody else's problem, right? And there are other approaches too, but those are, I think, the three primary ones. And that's directly applicable to how we think about Space Force and some of the things that Zach was just talking about, right? So from so assuming the risk perspective, right? If you look at the spacecraft that I grew up in the Space Force flying in the Air Force, and then before I joined the Space Force, cost over $1 billion each, and that was in 1995 dollars, right?
Wow.
So you look at, I grew up working with our strategic satellite communications, the satellites the president would use to communicate in the event of nuclear war, and our strategic missile warning satellites, the satellites that would detect a missile launch against the United States. Those are things that have to work. They have to work all the time. Launch back then was really hard, and it was really expensive. And so we put basically the whole kitchen sink into each of those satellites. For example, on missile warning today, we have a system called the Space-Based Infrared System, SBIR. We have 6 of those satellites around the globe, and they monitor any missile launch anywhere on Earth. They're staying, the ones watching the Red Sea are staying pretty busy right now. Those are critical systems, but we've got 6 of them, and they're really big, and they the bad guys know where they are, and so it wouldn't be really hard to shoot one of those down, right? Or somehow otherwise take that out. That's a risk that we can't assume. Like that risk is too great because it leaves us blind in space. So how do you mitigate that? Well, one way is just to make it cheaper and make more of them, right? And our next generation of missile warning architecture is going to do that. They'll be in a different orbit. It'll be a lot more satellites. And that right there gives you a lot more ability to absorb that risk and to mitigate the risk. Each one's cheaper. Each one is not as critical. So if I lose one or two or three, I can keep doing the job. But it's also, they're not as expensive. So I can try out new things. And we're seeing that today, that both Space Systems Command and the Space Development Agency are trying out some new architecture designs, trying out some new sensor designs to see what works. Because they're cheaper, we can build them and launch them more quickly and more inexpensively. We can try things out. So that's a different way to mitigate the risk. And then finally, in some respects, right, we could pass the risk on to somebody else, and that's where I think commercial comes in, right? If we want to be able to use different commercial capabilities, and if there's 2 or 3 or 4 commercial operators who I can buy this capability from, then I can just do that instead of having to assume that risk myself. I can just buy it on the commercial market. That doesn't make sense for everything. Maybe missile warning, for example, is not one that's quite ready yet for the commercial sector, but those are things that we want to think about and different ways to approach the risk. So I think the fact that launch is a lot cheaper, thanks in large part to innovation in the commercial sector, the fact that building satellites is a lot cheaper and takes a lot less time, is really shows that we can think of different ways to do the same job in a way that there's a lot less risk. And so that allows us to take more risk on individual missions, try out new technologies, because all of our eggs aren't in one basket. And so I think that's where Space Force is definitely headed, as far as if you look at what we're building now versus what we had built in the past, is we're building an architecture that allows us to take a lot more risk.
And therefore also be better stewards of public money, right?
Yeah.
Right, because if it's cheaper to build and cheaper to launch, then there is less money at risk, so to speak.
Yes, that's true.
Now, this last question I want to ask you, and I know, Rhet, you have something to say about this. What, if you could choose out of all the things, would be a key approach to adequately meet the needs of today's commercial and defense space operations and the threat landscape, right? Because I know that you will always be thinking about the threat landscape, but in a way that's evolvable for the future, right? I have this feeling that the word modular might come into this, or interoperable might come to mind. So what would be a key approach or approaches?
Yeah, so I think, you nailed it there. Interoperable is one of the things I would think about, right? Is today, most of our systems aren't interoperable, right? Even inside Space Force, so many of our systems, they're built by different manufacturers. They use different ground systems. They use different antennas. They're not interoperable because when we built them, they didn't need to be. Today, they need to be. And this is where I think we really have to have a conversation and a partnership with industry. One approach, and we've done this, and the military has done this in the past, is just to dictate and say, hey, if you want to do business with us, this is what you're going to use. All the engineers are like, hey, but nobody else in the world uses that. Tough, go build it, right? And we end up getting something really bespoke and expensive. And sometimes there's good reasons for that, but more often, I think it makes much more sense to figure out, well, what's best practice? The commercial operators have they have more skin in the game here, because they've got to show a profit or loss and actually make money on whatever they're building. And so they've got a fair amount of skin in the game on making sure that they make the right choices from a technology perspective, from an interoperability perspective. So let's partner with commercial companies, figure out what are those standards, the things where we really need to agree on. Hey, if I want to be able to use Starlink as an example, as a backup communication system, well, all of my communications gear needs to be able to talk to Starlink, right? If I want to be able to if your satellite can do inter-satellite communications, satellite to satellite crosslinks and communication, which provides a fair amount of resilience in a contested kind of environment where somebody's trying to deny your comm links, or they've taken out your ground station or something. If I want to be able to talk from my satellite to your satellite, well, we've got to be on the same wavelength. We've got to be able to understand each other's communications protocols and those kinds of things. And so we need to have a conversation about what are those? Do those make sense for us to adopt? Are there places where we need to tweak it? And be very judicious about that. So just as one example of what we're doing there in that regard is Space Systems Command recently stood up an actual formal standards body with industry and the IEEE, who's who kind of respected standards organization.
Oh, it's a major organization, and it's very heavy on engineers. Yeah,
to run this for us, to say, look, we want to have standards that we agree on. We need commercial buy-in, but we don't know best necessarily. So let's have a conversation, and then when we can find agreement, let's standardize it. Let's put it down in writing and agree to it, and then publish it so that everybody can use it. And I think that helps us all. I mean, just for the audience, you use this every day. You don't have to negotiate a new Wi-Fi protocol and change the configuration on your phone every time you connect to a new access point. It just works. It works because there's a Wi-Fi consortium who said, this is the standard we're all going to use. And so we need the same kinds of things for space to be able to, whether it's refueling, whether it's communication, whether it's navigation and positioning, all of those things, we need standards that we can all agree on and work together.
And I'd like to underline something you said that I'm not really sure the audience will be too terribly aware of, but when the IEEE actually gets involved into standards making, it isn't just even a U.S. thing. It's a very international thing. And because we have really a world economy, and a lot of parts that go into U.S. space systems are in supply chains that are sometimes, originate overseas. So it becomes even more important when you're talking about, going back also to de-risking things, because if things can become more standard and it can be part of that supply chain process, then it becomes less expensive to actually try new things.
Yes, right. That's true.
Exactly. Zach, final word on that?
I would just say that I agree completely. I think, you mentioned modularity. I would say from my view, the best way we can mitigate risk and uncertainty is by investing in resilience, by redundance, by, modularity, interoperability. One thing that I think that will help that over the mid to long term is the Honorable John Plum just announced a SAP revision program in space capabilities at DoD that was endorsed by the Deputy Secretary. That will help, I think, bring a lot of space capabilities more into the open over the near term, and that will help to allow us to do more interoperability and to establish those standards. Because a big problem that we've had in the past, and for good reason, is most space capabilities have been very compartmentalized and secretive, and we couldn't talk about any of them. And even amongst ourselves in the United States government, you couldn't talk about any of the capabilities we had. And so few people knew about them that interoperability would just a pipe dream. Right. So I think as we get more open and transparent going forward, we will be able to invest more broadly in things like modularity and interoperability. And I think that's a good thing.
Gentlemen, we have reached the end of our time for this segment. So, Rhet, Zach, thank you so much for joining me today.
Laura, thanks. Zach, it was great. I enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely.